Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. We are continuing our special podcast series based on Consider Yourself as Eve, a guide to spiritual development for women and the men who love them. I am grateful to be joined again by my friend Jocelyn Pedersen. She and Corey both participated in the episode covering chapter 1. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely go back and check that out if you would like to. Today, we're going to be continuing our discussion. We are now on chapter 3, which is entitled The Natural Woman. The main sections in this chapter include Mother of All Living, where we talk about Eve as our primary template of the divine feminine, Tree of Life, the Ordinance of Birth, the Light of Christ, and the Tower. These are all themes that have to do with who we naturally are as women and exploring the question of whether the natural woman has the same description and characteristics as the natural man. Now, I want to be really careful when I say that, of course, because I'm not suggesting that women are not fallen the same as men. We are. We are all cut off from the presence of God. However, I think that there are things about women and about our stewardship as mothers and those who give life, all of us being mothers, that put us in a unique position that maybe warrants that we aren't called enemies of God like the natural man is. So, with that being said, Jocelyn, thanks so much for coming back and having this conversation with me. Again, I feel like so little of this book really originated with me. And so I appreciate being able to have conversations with some of the key people in my life that helped present some of these threads of truth and helped me in the process of weaving them together. So, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. I'm so thrilled that you invited me and that our conversations have been so productive as to lead to this book that you've written.
I know this is so much more formal than just voice messaging back and forth
Yeah.
on Messenger all day long, which is
Yeah.
usually what we do
Yeah.
about some of these things. Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, one of the main features of this chapter that was really powerful to learn and write is the section on Mother of All Living, which is about Eve. Eve is our primary example of the divine feminine and of the process of ascension for women, of how we fulfill and step into our stewardship, the things that are required to bring us into a state of balance between our physical bodies and our feminine spirits. She is really the beginning and the end of it all. And that's part of why this book is called Consider Yourself as Eve, is that we are trying to move through the pattern of spiritual development and have the wisdom and just to be like Eve, because she really is the best of women in a lot of ways. So in this section, I present some information from a scriptural perspective to help maybe give us a new perspective on Eve. And I'm not doing this to suggest that my interpretation is the right way or the only way to look at it, but rather to help give us maybe a narrative that better supports some of the dualities that we as women face. So, for example, a lot of the world believes a narrative about Eve that basically suggests that it was all her fault and that what she did was a gross error and that it was horrible. And as a result, women receive this message that we are bad, that things are our fault, that we are horrible, that sin came into the world because of us. We inherit that belief when we look at our mother and say that, well, we came from her, therefore we must be that way too. And this perspective is really used, I think, to promote masculinity in women and to say you need to be more controlled, you need to fit in a certain box, you need to not color outside the lines, you need to be more like men. Which, as we discuss with chapter 2 and Ali Duzette, it's not helpful for women to adopt masculinity. In fact, that can be really harmful. And our spiritual development is dependent on us becoming more feminine. The opposite side, or another narrative that we often hear, is like, well, Eve was actually really great, but she was just really dumb and she got deceived and she got beguiled. And that's kind of hard too, because in the one way, we're saying, well, Eve was wonderful. She was Adam's equivalent and Adam was so great, but also she was still the problem, you know? So anyway, Jocelyn, do you have any thoughts on like kind of the narratives that we've inherited about Eve and how perhaps those things are not the most useful for helping us to understand women and who we truly are in relationship to God, our heavenly parents.
Well, I think as we discussed with Corey, the most important thing any of us can do is to go to God in prayer, right? Study, meditation, and receive personal revelation about all of this. We do have all of these traditions that have been handed down to us. And I think it's up to us to glean the truth from that and just let the rest go. So for me, I remember I was meditating one day. I don't think I was even thinking about Eve or the book of Genesis. I was literally just trying to like commune with God. And I just all of a sudden, like I had this flash of inspiration. And it was like so fast, like where I got from point A to like point C. But I just got that, oh my gosh, Eve is a heavenly mother. And and the steps that I got to that were my understanding. I think I was going through the temple ceremony in my mind. That's probably how I got there. But I realized, oh, Eve was taken out of Adam. What does that mean? She was taken out of Adam, and Adam in could be interpreted ha-adam, that really is just a word for man or mankind. And so I just suddenly had this understanding that Eve represents those of us who are the chosen. You could say holy ones. Holy ones kind of means sanctified. It can mean kind of separated out in that way. It's those who have been separated out from this celestial world and recreated or reborn in a higher, holier place. And that's where Eve was created. In every scriptural account that we have, that is the process. And then Adam had to continue to ascend to meet her where she was, but where she was not just in the Garden of Eden. She was where the tree was, the highest, holiest place up high in the Garden of Eden. So she really did represent a heavenly being. And then when you understand that her name was changed, right? She was given this name of Chava, which is mother of all living. She literally becomes like this heavenly mother figure. So there's your heavenly mother right there at the beginning of Genesis. And she represents all of us, particularly women, in our ascension journey, ascending back into the presence of God, into the Garden of Eden, into the Holy of Holies, essentially. So
Thank
I
you.
think, yeah. I just think that there are so many different ways of looking at this if we let the spirit tutor us and kind of go of all those traditions of men.
Yeah. And to
Yeah.
be clear too, like I think it's important to say that just because we are presenting one particular perspective, that doesn't negate all other perspectives. Like
Mhm.
we all look at truth from just the angle that we can see it from.
Mhm.
Someone else could see it from the opposite angle, and both of those things are true. It's important for us to then go and try to find all the different perspectives because when we have more and more perspectives that reflect different angles of that which is true, we can weave them together, and that brings us into a better picture of what actually went on. So, thank you for sharing that. I love what you said about Eve being created in a higher place. It's interesting because if you go to the scriptural accounts, you have the creation of Adam from the dust of the earth, and he is in a terrestrial state, and then he's introduced into the garden before Eve is created. And the garden is not all of Eden, right? I think sometimes we think all of Eden was the garden. No, Eden was a terrestrial plane and there was a garden in it. He's
Mhm.
introduced into that garden, and that garden could be seen as like a temple space or as a celestial space, a place where our heavenly parents could descend and commune with those in the terrestrial sphere, right? In the same way that our temples today are meant to represent sacred space where God can descend and meet with us here in a celestial space. That's the hope behind it. And so Eve was created in that temple, in the Garden of Eden, where Adam was created outside of it. And again, none of this is supposed to suggest and like to put down men. That's not what we're doing. Rather, we're just trying to share a perspective that helps us as women understand who we really are and our potential, and that we are, as Jocelyn said, reflections of Heavenly Mother. So in that chapter, I go into more depth on the scriptures and what it is that they actually say. I talk about Eve being created in a celestial sphere. I talk about that the commandment to not partake of the tree was actually only given to Adam. That's
Mhm.
actually really interesting. There are some traditions that suggest that Adam and Eve were kind of together embodied in Adam, that he was kind of an androgynous being. I think that that's kind of has its own complications to it if we wanted to look at it that way, but that is another way, another avenue that you could explore and say, okay, what levels of truth can I glean from this interpretation? But for our purposes, I go through the scriptures of just seeing that Adam was a masculine spirit who was embodied in a male body. And then later, after he received the commandment to not partake of the fruit of the tree, Eve was created, a feminine spirit who was embodied in a female body. And that law was never given again. It was never given to Eve. And I make the case that that's because that law actually only applied to Adam. That was crucial for him, for his spiritual development, for him being able to fulfill his masculine stewardship. But it did not apply to Eve. If she was to become the mother of all living, she actually needed to partake of the fruit of the tree. Now, how does that compare then to the scriptural account that says, well, Eve was beguiled, right? She says that she was beguiled. I have some thoughts that I talk about in the book, but Jocelyn, I'm just curious if you have thought about why it might be that Eve, if it was her stewardship and if she hadn't been commanded not to partake of the fruit, why would she then go back and say, oh, I was beguiled by the serpent? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, because it was the serpent who was the one who tried to initiate her into that role. But we know who that serpent was. It was Satan. And clearly, it was not his prerogative to do that. I remember actually having this conversation with one of my daughters. She had just gone through the temple. She doesn't get to go a lot, so I was able to help her go through it. And she just said, I've always had this question, like, why is Satan punished for doing something that it seemed like it was okay to do at other times or in other places? Why is he punished for doing that then? And I said, because that was the woman's prerogative, not his. He was man essentially, right? He was coming from that male role. And it seems to me and to you, this was clearly a feminine role of creating life, initiating life. And that was not his job to offer her that fruit. So it's interesting to consider that we know that the serpent imagery can be two-sided. It represents Satan, but it also represents Jesus Christ. And I think some of my understanding comes from when I was looking up the idea of serpents, actually with the serpent on the pole. And I really wanted to understand that imagery better. And I realized, oh, the name for serpent and the name for angel, it's kind of the same word. It's seraph or saraf. And in the Hebrew, you don't really have vowels. So it's actually the same word. So Satan could be interpreted as appearing to Eve as a fiery, flying seraph. And he may have even been, he could have been presenting himself as Christ. He could have been a false Christ figure. If we really want to go deep into the weeds of this, we could also say, well, since this was a feminine role, it could have been the feminine aspect of God that was supposed to present Eve with that, perhaps the wife of God in some way. And so in Satan trying to usurp that feminine role and do that really was the punishment. He overstepped his bounds. And you can see the pattern of that throughout history. It's kind of interesting. Satan is always trying to bring women's power. Like that's kind of his MO, is to take over everything that women do, from childbirth, you could say, to right to like our sexuality, to our beauty, to the role of mothers, to the, even you could say in this day and age, gender, right? The fact, just the idea of being a woman, it just seems to be twisted or used for evil purposes in so many ways. And it's possible this literally goes back to the beginning of time in the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, these are a lot of things that I felt impressed with writing this book too, is that it was not that Eve stepped outside of her stewardship. In fact,
Hmm.
it was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
She was stepping into her stewardship, at and it was Satan who had stepped outside of his stewardship. It was a violation on his part, and that's why he was cursed. He was stripped of his glory. He was cast out into the telestial plane. I think it's interesting that it's never called Eve's transgression. In the
Hmm.
Book of Mormon, especially, which we know is the most correct book, it's always referred to as Adam's transgression. And I
Hmm.
go into detail a little bit more about what that transgression means. It's not so much that, like, oh, it was this sinful thing that Adam did. It's more about that he was set off balance between his
Hmm.
masculine body and his masculine spirit and his male body. He was, in choosing to follow Eve, actually doing something incredibly brave and self sacrificing, which was leaving a place where he was fulfilling his stewardship. He was balanced and going into a plane where he wasn't anymore for the purpose of being with Eve. And I think that that's really important. Recently, Jocelyn and I were also introduced to more content from our friend Donna Nielsen. I know that I attributed some to her in our previous conversation when we were talking about chapter one. But she additionally sent us this really beautiful telling of the tradition of Adam and Eve in India. And I love this telling because, again, I think that it shows a better picture of who our first parents were. And so in this telling, man is created, they're in the garden space. It is the Hindu version, and so Brahma is the name of God that creates them. And it's Adima and Heva, Adam and Eve, that are created, and that these were beings who had the highest degree of love and courage. And they are placed in this garden and they are told not to go outside of the garden and that this is where they need to stay. And Adam was the one who was leading out saying, "No, let's go further. Let's explore farther." And Eve kind of had a sense of like, "I don't know if we should do that." But she loved Adam and she wanted to be with him. And so she went with him, and eventually they encounter this beautiful island, that there's kind of a bridge to, and they say, "Oh, let's go, let's go over there." And so they leave the main garden and they travel to this island, and it's beautiful. It says it's like a dream, and it turns out that it was a deception and that they had traveled too far, and that lightning pierced the sky and thunder boomed and the earth shook and everything was still, but it was no longer this beautiful island place. It was rocks and sand and desolation. And Adam was in despair, and Eve turned to him and said, "Don't despair. Let's pray to Brahma for guidance." And Brahma appears, and I really love this exchange. So, as Eve spoke, Brahma appeared, and because of their disobedience in leaving the island, he condemned them to the lowest hell. Adima, taking courage, pleaded for his wife, "O Supreme Lord of all things, it was my fault. Do not punish Heva." Hearing this, Heva hastened to speak, "If you do not spare my husband, do not spare me either. I would not wish to live without him." Then the all powerful Lord, smiling with infinite tenderness, said, "Because of your love and courage, I will spare you both, and I will watch over you and your children forever. You, Heva, have sinned through love of your husband, whom I desired you to love. Your heart never turned from me, but by this disobedience of the spirit of evil or matter has gained a foothold upon the earth. Therefore, neither of you may return to the garden of terrestrial paradise, but hereafter you will live in the world. You and your offspring will labor and suffer. They may become corrupt and even turn from me. However, I will send Vishnu, the preserver of wisdom, to be born from the womb of a woman. He shall once again bring hope by pointing the way to enlightenment for mankind." So anyway, this is just like an Indian accounting of the creation, right? And of Adam and Eve, and really laying out the beginning of the endowment, right? That Vishnu, who's a type of Jesus Christ, will descend and will be the redeemer for the people. But Jocelyn, was there anything about that story that particularly stood out to you? I just love this idea that our legacy as humankind comes from two people who loved each other, were devoted to each other,
Hmm.
weren't finger pointing at each other, but that were willing to sacrifice for each other and go on this grand adventure together, and that God respected that in them. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are good things to be learned from each of those versions. And there are other versions out there too. There are more ancient versions of the story of Persephone or the story of Pandora that actually show the woman, I would say, in a more empowered light. And I think that's the takeaway from these stories is women have a very specific role. There's something really specific that we represent. And like you said, it's not to say that all men are down here and women are up here, but that is our calling, is to represent sort of leading humanity back into this higher space, helping men to remember who they are and to come into balance with their spirits and the natural man, and to represent the higher holy spiritual path, and to be able to empower men to do that by being that example, by being that Christ-like example of sacrifice, right? Out of love for somebody else, which is what I see her doing, right? Being willing. And that's what every mother does who brings a child into this world. And that doesn't mean if you haven't had a baby, you don't feel that or represent that as well. But that's just kind of the role of women. And I think likewise, because Eve was the one to initiate life in the Genesis story, it is also her responsibility to help that life come to full fruition, to be born again and become like God. And of course, in your book, you do such a good job of sort of delineating the roles. It's like here, yes, the priesthood, this is the role they play. And then you could say the priestesshood, right? The role of women, here is the role you play. And they go hand in hand. It's not that you can have one without the other. That certainly is not the case. You have to have both. But I think what is helpful about reviewing these narratives from a feminine perspective is recognizing the power that women have. Because I think right now, we only see sort of these masculine structures. It's very kind of masculine church. You have a priesthood, and that's great. Like that's necessary. God has that for a reason. But women are sort of out here like, well, where do we fit in then? And like where when President Nelson asks us to step into our priesthood, what does that even mean? Because like we don't serve the sacrament at church, or so what does that look like? And it starts with stepping into our role as Eve and understanding what Eve really represents and going
Mhm.
from there.
Yeah. And I think that we have intuitively kind of leaned towards that. Like, as a broader organization, I've had really good conversations on the podcast with people who see like, oh, women do, like they bring us into this world, they're initiating life. But then we kind of compartmentalize it from what men do and say, well, women bring us into this world, which we don't really comprehend how magnanimous that is by itself, because it's our paradigm and we're just used to how that is, and so we lose esteem for that role of mothers right away. But then we say, well, it's the priesthood's job to get us back, like they're the ones with the ordinances that will bring us back to God. And in reality, and what I would show in my book, is that it's not only the priesthood, it's the priesthood and the priestesshood. When we come into this world, we're in a state of disintegration, meaning like my body and my spirit are disaligned, are misaligned from each other. I'm imbalanced. I'm misaligned from the people around me, particularly my spouse. It takes a lifetime of working together to try and bring balance to that relationship. And so, what the gospel is trying to show us is like, yes, women are the tree of knowledge of good and evil that bring us into this world, that help bestow the light of Christ. That's something that I talk about in my book. That's one of our primary roles. There's a reason that women are seen as more naturally spiritual. That's doctrinal, and that's because we are the vessels that bestow the light of Christ. We are the ones that Jesus Christ has called to bestow the first token, the gift of grace, which is the light of Christ. So we have a more natural affinity for the spiritual because that's our job. Our job is embodiment, to bring that which is spiritual into physical reality. However, you can't just stop there and say, okay, well, now it's just the men that are going to get us back home. In reality, what the gospel is inviting us to do is to come into a state of integration where I'm balanced in myself, I'm aligned to my partner, and together, as husband and wife, we are going to ascend with our family. We're going to bring our children, we are going to bring each other back into the presence of God. And it really goes along with that idea of, I help thee and thou help me, and we will ascend together. That's the true pattern. So I just want to add that it's not just that women bring us into this world. Women are key to helping us get back as well with our men. And we need to be aware of that so that we can step into that role. And part of that role, as Jocelyn said, could be that we serve as a template, that we show our men in a very physical way, this is what it looks like to sacrifice near unto death to bring forth new life. Because that's what the men need to learn how to do for their stewardship. And we are a very physical, visible template and example of that. And we know that our men are very visual. And so women have the opportunity to be that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just think that you tied that in well, and you took a whole book to kind of explain this. It's hard to go into the nuance of
Mm-hmm.
this, and how it all fits together just in a discussion.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That's what the book's for.
yeah, that's what the
This
book
is
is for.
just meant to be kind of introductory to give us an idea. But
Right.
anyway, hopefully,
But there's a reason why so many times, church leaders and things like that will get up in conference and talk about how women are more spiritual, or women, we need you. I mean, even in the Worldwide Relief Society broadcast, President Nelson said, look, we need you. We need you to do these things, and you have the power to change the world.
mm,
And like Wendy Nelson has said about her husband, he's not being bombastic. Like, if he's saying these things, these are the things the Lord would have him say. So why is he telling the women that we have the power to change the world if we step up and do our part? And in a lot of ways, it's because that's been the missing piece this whole time. We kind of understand the man's role, to the extent that you can without the woman being as big of a part of it, right? But I've seen this played out in my own family. I've seen this played out in other people's families when women wake up to who they are. And it kind of goes to that principle of ladies first, right? If women take that step first, they lead their family. If men do their role, which, yes, it is a very typical role of providing and protecting and doing all of those physical Aaronic priesthood need types of things that need to happen, to create a space wherein women can come to this understanding, can come into balance with who they are. If women can take the time to step into that role and do that, the whole family goes with them, and then the community, and then the church as a whole, and the world. We all will rise up, but it starts with women. It really does. It really
mm.
does.
Yeah,
And
and that's why
yeah,
it's a grassroots effort, right? The
yeah.
feminine is down here, the masculine's up here, like this vertical motion, right? We're down here. It's grassroots of women waking up and saying, no, 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 I am a daughter of Eve.
Mm.
I understand that she had an intuitive sense and that she sought wisdom. She wanted to be like her heavenly mother. And she intuitively knew what was going to be a part of that. And yes, maybe she was deceived in that she got the go ahead from someone who wasn't who she thought he was. And maybe she was deceived in the timing of that wasn't right, and that the authoritative, directive to take the fruit had not yet actually been given yet.
Mm.
But she knew who she was. She knew where she was going, and she was fearless enough to go there. And she did her work of inviting her husband to come along with her. That's that whole principle of coming first, right? And this is something that I talk about more throughout the whole book as well, is the idea that in part of giving life, part of how we give life is that we give life to our husbands. That by learning how to be feminine and to stand in our femininity, in our feminine stewardship, that we invite them to put off the natural man. We invite them to come into a covenant relationship with God so that they can regain that balance that Adam willingly sacrificed, and then begin to facilitate covenant relationships with all of humanity, which that's the priesthood stewardship, right? And men are going to be more likely to fulfill that if we women fulfill our stewardship of giving them life, of being that example, of descending unto death to bring forth new life. And Eve was the first example of that, and she did her work perfectly. Okay, Eve
And
did
that,
not make a mistake.
no, and the thing is, that role is so intuitive for women because essentially we come with that priesthood power. We're just born with that. And so, I mean, we create life we have that ability almost from the time before we're born. So because it's so intuitive, it's easy to dismiss that. And I think that's part of the problem, right? Is we don't recognize what it is we're doing. And Joseph Smith, I think, did such a beautiful job when he was addressing the Relief Society of bringing that to the light. He just told women, look, just do what you naturally do. Just be that example for your husband. Yes, step into your priesthood gifts. Yes, you're natural healers. Yes, you can speak in tongues. Yes, you could do those are great too. Like that's all wonderful. But the most powerful thing you have is just being a woman. And if
Mm-hmm.
you do that, angels cannot be restrained from being your companions, and you can enter the presence of God just fine. There's nothing holding
Mm-hmm.
you back if you step into that role of womanhood.
Yeah. And this is a huge difference between masculine spirit and feminine spirit, because masculine spirit, it is defined and it is strengthened by the energy of doing, of being
Mm-hmm.
productive,
Yes.
of checking the boxes, of being active. Like that is masculine spirit. That is how men will thrive, is if
Mm-hmm.
they step into that motion. Opposite that, the power of femininity is in being.
Mm-hmm.
It is in the fact that we exist. It is in the fact that we are feminine spirits in female bodies. That is our value. And yes, we have opportunities to do the same as men have opportunities to be. We each have a little bit of the opposite energy. But for the most part, our spiritual development and fulfilling this stewardship of giving life, and especially as becoming a template for our husband, that is going to be best achieved by stepping into just being who we are. We are daughters of Eve. That is powerful. Satan can no longer have the power in my mind to convince me otherwise, right? And
Mm-hmm.
owning our identity, owning our gifts, owning the power that we've been given, as Joseph Smith said, he said, "You have the key. This is your key." He gave he said to Emma, to the Relief Society. And Emma was the one that said, "Okay, thank you. You can go now. We're going to start doing our thing." And he was happy to
Yeah.
leave because we we have it inside of us. We have the intuitive power. We have that connection to the light of Christ to know what we need to do and become. We just need eyes to see it. We've been so blinded to the
Mm.
reality of women and who we are. And so,
Well, yeah, because we've been given the false version
right.
of women. Like all we see around us is the false version. And so either if you're a powerful woman, you're more like a man. Well, that
Mhm.
means being like a man or doing everything a man can do, but more because we're also trying to do everything women do, right?
Mhm.
And so that's one way in which we become super imbalanced and we try and embody these masculine principles, and oftentimes we don't do a great job of it because we're not men, quite frankly. Or it's but the feminine, it's so weak, it's such a victim, she just does nothing. And it's like, no, that's not true either. And I think one of the best metaphors for that is childbirth, right? As women, what do we do to bring new life into this world? You make a choice, yes, but we don't control the rest of it. We're not doing and making it happen. And now every day I got to get up and do
Thank
something to make
goodness.
it,
Oh my
right? I
gosh, can
know.
you imagine if we had
It's
to
like,
control that? Oh my.
no, yeah, no, what are we? We are vessels. We are vessels for that light of Christ to come in and do this creative work, this creative process. And what we're doing is we're embodying that message for the world. And we're saying, yes, look, there are things in the gospel that we need to do. Yes, that is the initiation. That is the first step. But the rest of our relationship with God is extremely feminine, or should be. That's why we're called the bride. That's why we're referred to as daughters. It's not, you know what I mean? It's for the most part, we are described scripturally in a feminine role because God is supposed to be the one doing. We're supposed to be the ones receiving. And that doesn't mean you're doing nothing. It takes incredible faith to do that. It takes incredible faith to be still and let God do their work. And it's more than what we think it is, but it requires inspiration, it requires revelation, and it requires that time to be still, to do that and to explore that and to become. And in a world of do, busy, produce, it's a total distraction from becoming,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Becoming means being.
Yeah.
You have to do both.
Yeah. Yeah. Really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, I think that we covered a lot of the main themes of this chapter. Again, just exploring what is the natural woman. Well, the natural woman is like Mother Eve. She is intuitive, she is wise, she is fearless. She is a tree of life. Our bodies are trees of life. Something that was really special for me with my last baby is I felt really impressed to have a natural birth, which I hadn't had with my other kids at all.
Yes.
But I did, and I had him at home, and it was by far one of the most empowering experiences of my life. I think that this is actually one of the ways that the world has robbed women, is by putting birth under the medical complex, which is run primarily by men. I think that we've done a huge disservice to ourselves, um, and by ourselves, I mean all of humanity, by not letting that remain where it always was for millennia of time, which was that birth was about women, and women were the ones who ran it and who did it and were there for it, along with husbands, right? And it was a beautiful quorum that is created when we follow that pattern. Anyway, it is one of the most empowering things I have ever done as a woman. And I highly recommend it for any women that are considering or are pregnant or going to have children in the future. Consider doing a natural birth. I would recommend it, because it will help put you in touch with that fact that your body is a tree of life and that you bear the fruit of your children. Our bodies are often underappreciated or even despised. And that's just another way that the serpent continues to sink his teeth into women and try to distort the reality of how things actually are. Um, but all of that goes along with the ordinance of birth, which is the first ordinance symbolically represented in the temple that we all have participated in. Yay, we all have successfully completed the ordinance of birth. As we talked about a little bit earlier, we also discuss in this chapter how women are the vessels that bear and bestow the light of Christ. Do you want to talk about that just for a minute before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, I just love that you brought up having a natural birth. I felt inspired to do the same thing with my last child, at, definitely against my doctor's wishes. I mean, he was so upset with me because I had some high risk pregnancies before, but I had felt inspired to do this. I knew this was the right thing to do. And I knew I had been healing in a lot of ways. And I mean, he was so angry with me. It was to the point where like he left me, he like door open at the OBGYN's office, and like with a little blanket over me. And he was so angry. But when I did that, it was one of the most beautiful and spiritual experiences of my life. And on the other hand, my other daughter that I mentioned earlier, I didn't finish that story. When I told her that truth about Satan not being the one who had the right to offer that fruit to Eve, how that was a woman's perspective. You should have seen her face. I wish everybody could have just seen her face. It just lit up. And she's like, oh my gosh, that's true. That is correct. And I've been searching for this answer, and now I have it. And she's been such a beautiful uh, person in my life to help me to learn things. And one of the experiences that she had was in giving birth when I was there. And her births turned out differently from the ideal. She wanted to be able to do everything naturally. But her daughter, she was able to do a bit more naturally, but there were still a few things. We were in the hospital. She was just so stressed out. She was just having a hard time. They were inducing her. She was not progressing. Nothing was happening. And I felt inspired when I showed up because I was busy taking care of the toddler during the day. So by the time I showed up, she was kind of at her wit's end. And I just felt inspired to do a meditation with her. And as the words came to me of what to say, so much of it was about trusting her body, that her body knew what to do, that she had been prepared for eons as a woman to do this, but that there was nothing to do. There was nothing to prove at this point. It was just a matter of allowing what her intuition already knew, what her body already knew how to do, to just do its job. And it was so interesting to see the change that had come over her after that, because when I showed up, it was right before the labor, I didn't know quite how much she had been struggling before I got there. It was pretty bad. She wasn't being totally straight, forthcoming with me about how much she'd been struggling before. And that was such a healing moment for her, where she felt the veil so just completely part for her. She just said, I feel like I'm in heaven. I feel like I'm in heaven. And that lasted for at least the 10 days that I was there with her. She's like, I can't believe how much joy I feel, how close to heaven I feel. And so that's the beauty and power of what it means to be women. Even, like I said, even if you haven't had a baby, to be able to part the veil in that way, to be able to just be that vessel for that power to flow through, and help other people, come into fruition in their lives. That is what it means. And it's a much more empowering message than what the world tries to give us in these false versions.
Thank you. Yes, I I so appreciate that. That's a beautiful story and I think so true, it is the stewardship of all women to give life, to bring that which is spiritual into physical space, to embody that which is of a higher and holier order. And we all do that. And we best do that by being exactly who we are. There's not a checklist, there's not a manual, there's not a standard operating procedure for being a woman. Each of us is so unique. And as we lean into that and turn to our Heavenly Parents for guidance, as we learn the pattern of spiritual development through Jesus Christ and through the temple, we we learn how to give life all in just so many ways, in so many incredible ways. It's truly endless, the capacity that we have to give life, each in our own unique ways. And so it was a pleasure for me to learn that. That was something that I don't think I knew in so many words. It is really an intuitive sense, I think, that once we hear it and once we say it out loud, that I give life, that it does testify to ourselves. So, like, oh, yeah, that is true, as you were saying with your daughter's experience. So, it was a pleasure for me to learn that through writing this book. And this chapter in particular, I think, is one of my favorites. It's very special. And so, I hope that if you feel inclined, if anything that we've talked about today in this episode has struck your heart or maybe caused you to have a question or already impressed you as being true, that you'll take a look at Consider Yourself as Eve, a guide to spiritual development for women and the men who love them. Again, you can find the book on Amazon in paperback and hardback versions, as well as ebook, and we hope to have the audiobook out soon. But we'd love to hear your feedback. If you have any comments or questions, please reach out to us. Please comment on this video. Also, share, like, and subscribe. Share it with any women in your life or any men as well who you feel like would benefit from this discussion. Jocelyn, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Megan.